The dark side of the Force was nothing if not corrupting. It offered easy answers and instant strength, tempting even righteous beings into giving in and then drawing them down into the abyss, suffocating all else until its victims were wholly under its thrall. This process of corruption is one we've discussed many times before, and it's something we'll cover in greater depth some other time. Because we're not here to talk about how the path of the dark side begins, we're here to talk about how it ends. To do so, we'll be examining the stories of two of the most fearsome Sith Lords of all time. One was an eater of worlds, a lord of hunger, while the other was a lord of pain, a man so angry he refused to die. They followed the path of the dark side to its inevitable conclusion, becoming two of the most powerful Sith the galaxy had ever seen. Their names were Nihilus and Sion, and today we'll be using their stories to understand the true nature and inevitable results of the dark side. The path to the dark side could begin with any number of goals in mind, but as the dark side corrupted its victims, those goals had a tendency to fade in favor of the pursuit of power. The Sith embraced this, claiming that the pursuit of power was the only purpose of life, and in their paths down the dark side, they excised all other concerns from their lives, cutting out anything that would slow them down on the road to ultimate power. Those Sith that made it to the dark side's ultimate extreme valued only power, and they differed only in what sorts of power they were concerned with. Even then, most Sith were obsessed with one or both of two specific kinds of power: ultimate strength and eternal life. Most Sith never achieved those goals, but the two we'll be discussing today, Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion, did. Nihilus and Sion are the antagonists of Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, in which they act as the leaders of the Sith remnants left over from the collapse of Darth Revan's Sith Empire. The game establishes that they were spawned from the horrors of the Mandalorian Wars, particularly the conflict's gruesome final battle at Malachor 5, in which a Republic superweapon caused such enormous casualties that it created a wound in the Force centered around the now ravaged planet. Nihilus and Sion drew part of their power from this wound, and wherever they went, they took the horrors of Malachor with them, inflicting them upon the galaxy. Their goal was simple but devastating. They sought to exterminate the Jedi entirely. These Sith believed that the war against the Jedi, the war for control of the Force, was the only thing that mattered, for should the Jedi be wiped out, then the dark side would be triumphant and the galaxy would be theirs, no matter whether the Republic or a Sith Empire ruled. The world of politics and machines, of fleets and armies and industries, was insubstantial to Nihilus and Sion. Their war was a power of belief. In this, Nihilus and Sion can be said to represent a purer form of the Sith than the empires we might be more familiar with. They operated as the Sith were meant to operate, striking from the shadows, waging war through the Force, and feeding on the atrocities that resulted from their actions. They weren't concerned with the empires and the trappings of power, only with what they considered real power. Power in the Force. These two Sith Lords are some of the clearest examples Star Wars lore provides of what we'll call end-state dark side users. Sith who have gone all the way down the path of the dark side and have allowed it to consume them entirely. They represent Sith who had attained the ultimate goals of their order, and by examining them in turn, we can gain an understanding of the true nature of the dark side and the power it offers. We'll start with Darth Nihilus, the more well-known of the two.
You have strengths, whether you know it or not. And my master has his. His power is great, and it comes from hunger. He is a wound in the Force, more presence than flesh. And in his wake, life dies, sacrificing itself.
Nihilus was the Lord of Hunger, a black hole in the Force. He was created at Malachor 5, when the planet died at the close of the Mandalorian Wars, and on Malachor, he learned terrible techniques that made him a threat to life itself. In time, he grew powerful enough that he was able to escape Malachor, ripping a space wreck, the remains of the Republic battlecruiser Ravager, from the planet's gravity well. He gathered a crew from among the Sith remnants, and they became his slaves, bound to his will. During the Dark Wars, Nihilus and his crew wandered the darkness between the stars, seeking Jedi. When he found them, he and his fleet of Sith remnant ships would emerge from the void, and in their wake, all life would die. Nihilus is fairly well known among Star Wars fans, and if you've heard of him, then you've probably heard it said that he ate planets. That's an incomplete understanding of his ability, but it wasn't entirely wrong. Darth Nihilus was driven entirely by hunger, a hunger for the living force, which he could rip from living beings and consume on a truly enormous scale. He severed connections between living things, bleeding the force from them, and he fed on the death such techniques caused. The destruction of groups of force sensitives and force nexuses could sustain him for a time, but when neither was available, he could feed on non-force sensitives as well, one planet at a time. During the Dark Wars, Nihilus was drawn to any gathering of force sensitives, which meant that the Jedi couldn't gather in one place lest he detect their presence. They learned this the hard way on Katar, where the Jedi Council called a conclave of the galaxy's remaining Jedi in the hope that together they would be able to determine the threat that was destroying them. In a sense, they succeeded. When they gathered upon Katar, their presence was like a beacon to the Lord of Hunger, and Nihilus came for them. When he arrived, every living thing on the planet died. From the Jedi to the planet's Miraluka colonists to the smallest microbes, all living things on Katar died to feed the Lord of Hunger. All but a single Miraluka, Visas Ma, who Nihilus claimed as his apprentice. Nihilus embodied one of the two forms of ultimate power the Sith were obsessed with: ultimate strength. The immensity of his abilities is difficult to even comprehend, and the ability to consume a planet's worth of life through the Force at least seems to fairly inarguably be a form of ultimate power. And as befitting a true Sith, not even this incredible power was enough for Nihilus. The hunger never stopped, and he was single-mindedly devoted to consumption, to gaining ever greater power. According to Visas, he would not stop until he had consumed the galaxy, and from there, he would just move on to the next. His hunger for power was all he was, and it dominated his every moment, as befitting the Sith ideal. With that in mind, it's worth examining the exact nature of Nihilus's power in greater depth. So far, we've been vague about how exactly the whole thing worked, and that's because our source material is too. While it's generally implied that Nihilus's abilities worked by directly draining life from all living things on a planet at once, killing them in the process, it's also implied that Nihilus could feed on ordinary deaths in the same way. When his fleet attacked Telos at the climax of the Dark Wars, his ships bombarded Citadel Station, targeting civilians directly, and when his soldiers boarded the station, they killed everything in their path. Nihilus fed on these deaths as well, KOTOR 2 implies, which suggests that, to an extent, the actual destruction was sometimes carried out by his fleet, while Nihilus fed on the effects. But while that aspect of Nihilus's abilities are unclear, their nature is not. While Nihilus's power may seem like some obscure arcane art, it's actually something fundamental to the dark side, based on techniques that are instinctual to most Force users. The Force connected all living things, binding all of them together in infinite, intricate ways. Use of the Force was a matter of drawing on these connections, but how exactly this was done depended on the alignment of the Force adept in question. Lightsiders, as we've said many times, opened themselves up to the collective will of the Force, allowing it to guide their actions, which generally contributed to the strengthening and expansion of these connections between living things, while Darksiders denied the will of the Force and abused their interconnection with others for selfish needs. Jedi preferred to use the interconnection offered by the Force to strengthen life around them, while the fundamental basis of Sith techniques involved drawing on those bonds to steal strength from others, increasing their own power. But not all bonds in the Force were created equal. Some were especially strong, such as those between Force sensitives and those they had close relationships with, such as their trainers or apprentices. These strong Force bonds could be used to extreme effect. Lightsiders could use them to bring people back from the brink of death, strengthen others considerably, and even take on their pain and suffering, while Darksiders could use these bonds to drain the other person completely. There were a select few beings in the history of the galaxy who could form these strong bonds especially quickly, easily, and even subconsciously. These people would invariably become bonded to everyone around them, strengthening them or sapping their wills by their mere presence. Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile that acts as the player character in KOTOR 2, was one of these people, and Darth Nihilus was another. In KOTOR 2, Craig claims that Nihilus's technique was as old as the Sith themselves. It was the foundation of virtually every other Sith technique. All Sith, to different extents, fed upon the Force, abusing their interconnection with others to drain strength and power for themselves. But the advanced versions of this technique involved creating these strong Force bonds and draining absolutely everything from the other person, completely consuming the Force within them. When this was done, the other person would be worse than dead. They would be an absence, an echo in the Force. But Darth Nihilus was one of those with the ability to form strong bonds with everyone around them as a matter of instinct, and once he had learned how to drain these bonds, he gained tremendous power. That was all his ability really was. It was simple, but devastating. He made bonds with everyone around him and drained them either instantly or, as was the case with his crew, over long periods of time. And Nihilus's power was amplified by his connection to Malachor. Much like the Jedi exile, he carried a part of the wound of the Force that had been created there within him. That was the source of his hunger, his need to constantly feed on everything around him. It was to fill the void that had formed within him. But that was a void that could never be filled, and so his hunger could never be sated. As a result, Nihilus himself was what he made others into, an echo in the Force, an absence, not a person. Throughout KOTOR 2, it's repeatedly emphasized by Visas and Kreia, the two members of your party that are the most familiar with Darth Nihilus, that Nihilus has ceased to truly be a man anymore. As Visas claims, he is more presence than flesh, an entity instead of a person. This isn't some side effect of his abilities, but rather an inevitable outcome of having such power. As Kreia says, one cannot have power of that magnitude that he possesses and still think and perceive the universe as most do. They aren't necessarily claiming that Nihilus no longer has a physical human body, though Kreia does say that Nihilus is no longer concerned with physical matters, being so consumed by hunger that he has forgotten his own flesh. Rather, it's his spirit that has ceased to be human. His all-consuming hunger and tremendous power have warped his spirit and perceptions into something alien to all living things, an entity of hunger alone. In the past, we've talked about how the path of the dark side stripped away its victims' humanity, and in Darth Nihilus, we see an extreme example of this. But Nihilus, yet again, isn't as unique as he might appear. Nihilus wasn't the only Sith to have been so consumed by their obsession with power that they ceased to be human. In fact, That was virtually a requirement for being a Sith. The way of the dark side was anathema to humanity, and it was spiritually destructive in the extreme. Nihilus was different only due to the extreme scale of his power. While most Sith continued to think on a human level, Nihilus's planetary scale abilities warped his perceptions until he didn't really perceive individuals anymore.
I do not believe he knows his ship has been boarded, and if he did, he would not care. The extent of his power cannot be put into words, and his perceptions have grown as well. To him,
you are dust motes in a storm, a grain upon the beach, and as insignificant as a body that orbits the graveyard of Malachor.
On the surface, this might seem to just be another indication of Nihilus's incredible power. Many Sith would certainly think so. To have such power that other individuals are insignificant and imperceptible to you as the mites on your skin is as close to ultimate strength as most Sith could possibly imagine. But in KOTOR 2, if you express such sentiments to Traya, your mentor, she'll disagree.
Power? Do you think so? You would be wrong. There is no strength in the hunger he possesses, and the will behind his power is a primal thing, and it devours him as he devours others. His mere presence kills all around him, slowly feeding him. He is already dead. It is simply a question of how many he kills before he falls.
This insight is essential to understanding Darth Nihilus. His abilities are terrible and their scale is vast, but he completely lacks control over them. Indeed, in many cases, his consumption of the Force isn't even an ability, but an ambient effect of his presence. As you can see through the state of Colonel Tobin at the end of the game, just being around Nihilus slowly drains people. His power has grown to such a scale that he can no longer control it, and as a result, it isn't really his power at all, but an entity in its own right.
It is not something he can direct or focus, much like hunger itself. He is more of a hole in the Force than a living thing.
But Traya doesn't just reveal that Nihilus can't control his power. She reveals that his power is what controls him.
Because it is not something that can ever truly be controlled, and it leaves nothing to conquer in its wake. And it rules him, not the other way around. It has its own will, its own instincts.
This completely recontextualizes Darth Nihilus's character. Nihilus's power, his hunger, was all he was, but both the hunger and the power weren't his at all. They had their origins in Malachor, and they had grown into a force in their own right, for which Nihilus was merely a vessel. This hunger even had its own will and instincts, driving its host to seek out rich sources of the Force to consume. Nihilus himself had no choice in the matter. He was forced to go wherever his hunger led him. That he was more presence than flesh, no longer a man but an entity, was not a sign of tremendous strength, but of tremendous impotence. Nihilus's hunger was the entity, and Nihilus himself was nothing. The man behind the mask was an empty shell, a slave to his own all-consuming hunger. He could do nothing of his own accord, only follow where his hunger led him. This is why Traya claimed that Nihilus was already dead. He had no independence of action or thought, and what was left of his spirit was empty and meaningless, trapped within a shell of a body driven by another force entirely. Visas observes this at the end of KOTOR 2 after Darth Nihilus is slain, because for all the times he's spoken of as some untouchable entity, no longer a man, he does die in the end. If you let her, Visas will remove his mask, and if you ask her what she saw, her answer is brief: a man, nothing more. Darth Nihilus wasn't an entity himself, but a slave to one of his own creations. He was hollow, and so were the other Sith who followed his example. Darth Nihilus might seem like an anomaly among the Sith. The path he followed was fairly unique, and no other Sith Lord became so consumed by hunger that they became more entity than a living being, as Nihilus did. But hunger was far from unique to Nihilus. In many ways, Nihilus parallels a different sort of insatiable hunger, one that was far more common in the history of the Sith, the hunger of empires. Empires are another kind of insatiable force, a hunger in their own right. Like Darth Nihilus and like many other Sith, their goal is strength, which they understand as constant consumption. They must expand constantly in pursuit of new resources to consume to justify their own existence, but this constant consumption and growth never satisfies them. They expand until they overextend, at which point they invariably begin to turn back upon themselves. This was a pattern that many Sith empires experienced over the millennia, and one that Darth Sidious's Galactic Empire experienced as well. Much as Nihilus was consumed by the hunger of Malachor, many Sith over the years were consumed by the hunger of empires. Dark Lords like Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, Darth Malak and Darth Sidious were among them. These beings saw imperial control as a form of ultimate strength, a method of attaining wealth and influence beyond imagining. They were different from Darth Nihilus only in that they were preoccupied with material power instead of power in the Force, which to Nihilus and his contemporaries was understood to be the only power that truly mattered. But the principle was the same. All of these Sith were consumed by hunger. So Darth Nihilus wasn't as unique as he might seem. Rather, he was representative of the core truths of all empires, stripped of their facades. KOTOR 2 emphasizes this by having the terms Nihilus uses to describe his own philosophy eerily echo those used by the Galactic Empire to describe its ideology.
To make me believe in his cause. He convinced me the galaxy, all life, must die. He fed upon its ugliness, its screaming, and in its place, he left silence. And where there was chaos, he brought stillness and order. He cannot deny his hunger for long.
In converting Visas Ma to his cause, Nihilus apparently decided to go with the old lie of bringing order. Ironically, there's more truth in that word when applied to him than there was for the Empire. With the Empire, the idea of imperial order was an outright lie, but with Nihilus, there was a sort of twisted order in the annihilation of all life. To shamelessly steal a line from Tacitus, the Lord of Hunger would create a desert and call it peace. All this is to say that Darth Nihilus embodies the endless, insatiable greed of the dark side and its empires, the eternal push for expansion, for more wealth, more power, more influence. Such consumption is completely meaningless. The hunger never goes away, no matter how much is consumed, and no matter how much must be destroyed for that consumption. There's no strength in this, and no order either. Much like Darth Nihilus himself, the black hole in the Force, empires are hollow and so are their rulers. With empires, this inexorable expansion always turns back on itself, as we mentioned earlier, and Darth Nihilus met the same fate. As Traya said, Nihilus's hunger consumed him in the same way it consumed others. In fact, in the later stages of his life, his consumption of planets, Force nexuses, and Jedi was not done entirely out of a desire to increase his power, but also to slow his own torment. When Nihilus didn't feed, his power would turn back upon him and he would suffer.
The master suffers. If he cannot feed, then the hunger begins to consume him.
Nihilus's own insatiable hunger was ultimately his undoing. As with anything else that consumes without end and demands constant growth, Nihilus's power was doomed to fall back upon itself sooner or later. As the Jedi neared extinction, it would have been increasingly hard for Nihilus to sustain himself, and the hunger would have consumed him entirely. But before he even got to that point, he had been weakened enough that he was able to be destroyed at the Battle of Telos. His defeat was largely because the exile's disconnection from the Force rendered her immune to Nihilus' attempts at draining the Force from her, but it was his hunger that had made him desperate enough to attack Telos and put himself at such risk in the first place. Such was the case with many Sith over the years. Their eternal quests for ever greater power were always bound to turn back on them, and Darth Nihilus was far from the only Sith that destroyed himself. That's the first major lesson Darth Nihilus' story teaches us about the dark side, its inherently self-destructive nature. But there's another lesson in Nihilus' story as well, how this self-destructive nature reflects on the Sith concept of strength. As we've discussed before, the strength and power of Darth Nihilus was an illusion. In reality, what seemed like power was actually weakness. The more power Nihilus attained, the more power that controlled him and the weaker he himself actually became. In the end, he had all but ceased to exist, while his power did what it willed until it grew too great and turned back on its host. Nihilus could do nothing as it destroyed him. Hell, there wasn't really any of him left by that point, and this too was something endemic to the dark side. The Sith Code laid out a battle plan with the ultimate goal of freedom. How it defined freedom, however, was very specific. The path begins with passion, which helps one gain strength, which helps one gain power, which helps one achieve victory. Through victory, the Code claims, a Sith's chains are broken and they will have been freed by the Force. Of course, the Sith only understood freedom as it could be gained according to this battle plan. Freedom to the Sith meant a total lack of restrictions on their path to ultimate power. Now, freedom as a concept is something pretty much everyone considers positive, but freedom isn't an end in itself. Freedom in the abstract is completely meaningless. What matters is what you can do with that freedom, or what you want to achieve freedom from. And when the Sith talked about freedom, they weren't referring to the freedom to do anything worthwhile in life. Instead, the Sith saw genuinely worthy goals as chains, restrictions that held them back from the one true goal of ultimate power. Even then, they only valued power as an end in itself. Wanting power for a specific purpose is something the Sith would see as another restriction. This is pretty transparently a hollow goal, yet it was a hollow goal that was built into the path of the dark side. Cutting off restrictions wasn't just a matter of Sith philosophy, but something required to become stronger in the dark side. Thus, any Sith that got far enough down the path of the dark side was destined to turn out like Darth Nihilus. No matter what power they pursued, it would turn back on them eventually, because it would eventually become the only thing they lived for, and it would therefore control them. The freedom dreamed of by the Sith was really slavery of another sort. When the only thing you live for is the pursuit of power, then you've become slave to that power, bereft of independent thought or action, just like Nihilus. And for the many Sith that followed Nihilus's path, this not only meant enslavement, but self-destruction. Those who sought ultimate strength, whether in the form of extreme power in the Force or absolute imperial control, would create a monster beyond their control, one which was doomed to consume itself and its creators with it. Such was the case for Darth Nihilus, as well as for Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, Darth Malak, and Darth Sidious, Empire builders one and all, each of whom was destroyed by their own former partners in Empire, and each of whose empires tore themselves to pieces. But Darth Nihilus's path wasn't the only end state of the dark side. It was arguably the most foundational and the most common, as it was pretty much instinctual to those aligned with the dark side. But some Sith pursued other forms of ultimate power than raw strength. Rather, ultimate strength was one of two goals that the Sith focused on above all others, with the other being eternal life. To understand that path, we need to close the book on Darth Nihilus and discuss the other Sith Lord we mentioned in the intro, Darth Sion.
Die 100 times exile and still I will rise again as strong as before. The Force is pain. The Force is focus. The Force is that which drives the strong and kills the weak. I shall teach you this.
Darth Sion, the Lord of Pain, was no less fearsome than Darth Nihilus, but his motives and the way he operated were considerably different. Sion, too, was devoted to the death of all Jedi, and unlike Nihilus, he and his Sith assassins hunted them down one at a time. Nihilus's war was impersonal. The casualties were staggering, but he cared only for the spoils of victory, and the individual lives lost didn't even register to him. Sion was different. His war was a war of slaughter, driven solely by the desire to see the last of the Jedi die at his feet. But Sion was no ordinary Sith warrior, and this was evident from his appearance alone. His flesh was a deathly grey, riven by innumerable cracks and scars. His body was covered in wounds. And as a team of Republic medics discovered when they examined him aboard the cruiser Harbinger, these wounds weren't just surface level.
Checking the survivor from the Sith vessel. I'm not sure whether he's alive or dead, or what's even keeping him together. His flesh is cracked and scarred, and I'm registering several thousand fractures in his skeleton, as if each bone was splintered repeatedly over time, then put back together. Judging from the scar tissue, I believe these wounds took place before his death. If so, he must have been in constant pain. I have no idea what's been keeping him together.
What held Darth Sion together was the dark side of the Force and nothing else. His body was dead 1,000 times over, so utterly mutilated that it shouldn't have been able to remain in one piece. But through sheer force of will and his deep connection to the dark side, Sion was not only able to telekinetically hold his body together, but to keep himself alive within it. This came at a cost. Sion felt excruciating pain every second of his existence. But he drew on this pain and the extreme depths of his own anger and hatred for power. He used these emotions to fuel his command of the dark side, which he used to keep himself intact, which caused yet more pain. It was a vicious cycle, but one that rendered Darth Sion functionally immortal. Sion too was spawned from the horrors of Malachor, but unlike Nihilus, he had played an active role in the Sith Empire established by Darth Revan. This allowed him to witness firsthand the self-destructiveness of empires and of Darth Nihilus's path. When Darth Revan returned to the light side and Darth Malak was slain, the Sith Empire imploded, destroying itself in a brief but brutal struggle for power. Sion was in the Academy on Korriban when it happened, and he watched with disgust as the Sith turned on one another like beasts, squandering their power. To an extent, Darth Sion saw through the lie of Imperial strength and the cycle of consumption that drove Darth Nihilus. He understood that consumption was a means to an end, and unlike Nihilus, who maintained a fleet drawn from the Sith remnants, Sion's only permanent assets were his assassins, and he seized and discarded ships and other assets as he needed them. But Sion too had bought into the lie of ultimate power in the form of absolute strength, which he instead sought to achieve through the complete destruction of his enemies. Sion also contrasts with Nihilus in that he was much more deliberate in his actions. While Nihilus was entirely driven by his instincts, or rather the instincts of his hunger, Sion's actions were all very intentional and conscious. While Malachor had made him what he was, he embraced it. He consciously held his own body together through the Force. Every second of his life was lived by choice. And while Nihilus fed on the Jedi because he had to, Sion slaughtered the Jedi because he wanted to. It was his only purpose in life, but it was a purpose he had chosen for himself. But the motivations behind this ultimate goal were much more simplistic and unformed. He was driven simply by a desire to destroy, a desire born of pure malice.
I want her to die and see all that she has built cast down, all that she holds dear in shards at her feet.
In this respect, Nihilus can claim to at least have pretended to be more complex than Scion. As we touched on earlier, Nihilus had a rationalization for his need to purge the galaxy of life. It was a fairly bare bones and unconvincing ideology, but it was something, at least. Darth Scion had no ideology beyond the basic precepts of the Sith. His actions in the Dark Wars weren't motivated by teachings or beliefs, but by pure hatred, unreasoning and uncontrolled. Anger and hatred were only a few of the strong emotions that the Sith could draw on to fuel the dark side. Most commonly, the path to the dark side began with emotions like love, which were positive but could lead to dark places. After a while, those sorts of strong emotions became weaknesses for Sith, love especially, and Sith were expected to purge themselves of them. That was the goal of one of the more well-known Sith initiation rites, which involved the inductee killing the person they were closest to with the goal of cutting off their emotional grounding in the universe. Despite their use as a path to the dark side, the Sith saw strong emotions like love as restrictions that prevented them from attaining true freedom, distractions from the pursuit of ultimate power. But darker emotions like anger and hate were different, and they were useful at all stages of the path of the dark side. Anger and hatred are less feelings than they are reactions, a form of lashing out at perceived threats. They don't require any of the forms of human connection that were anathema to the Sith. In fact, the more the Sith purged themselves of their humanity, the more angry and hateful they became. Though Sith would never admit it, this was at least partially due to the isolation and loneliness brought on by the path of the dark side, by the wounds that they had inflicted on themselves by cutting all their bonds. But regardless of the cause, anger and hatred were reliable sources of strength for the Sith, and Darth Scion was filled with both of them. Scion's anger and hatred drove him toward a single goal: violence. He sought the death of all his enemies, and he sought to make those deaths as painful as possible so that his victims would come to mirror him. His usual approach to achieving that goal usually just involved more violence, though Scion wasn't completely reliant on brute force. On two notable occasions, out of the 3 times the player encounters him in KOTOR 2, he set straightforward but well thought out traps. But once the trap was closed, or when he saw no use in subtlety, Scion's approach was raw brute force, something he excelled at due to his effective immortality. And even when he relied on methods other than brute force, and even when his goals were more complex than murder, he always thought of them in terms of killing.
I will bring his corpse to her, cast it at her feet. It will be as if killing her children. I will kill all she protects, all she shields, until her hands are drenched in blood.
Scion's extreme hatred, of course, partially owed itself to his constant pain. Scion wasn't called the Lord of Pain for nothing. His existence was torture, and that was a source of strength for him. He drew on his pain to fuel his power, and his pain amplified his anger and hatred. This made him tougher as well. His constant agony gave him a very high threshold for withstanding normal sorts of pain, to the point where even lightsaber burns were just another source of power for him to draw on. The harder his opponents fought, the stronger Scion would become. Scion's pain, however, wasn't just physical. Though he wouldn't admit it, even to himself, there was more to Darth Scion than hatred. Much of Scion's fury stemmed from deep-rooted trauma, which was a source of pain for him as much as his physical wounds were. The precise nature of this trauma isn't entirely known. KOTOR 2 does show us plainly that a lot of it stemmed from his training at the hands of, spoiler alert, Traya. Her training is said to have broken him, and his lingering trauma from it is a major factor in Sion's motivations throughout the game. It's also implied that part of Sion's trauma came from Malachor.
It is not possible to walk away from such things unscarred, to keep living when the universe dies around you.
Whatever the source, Sion buried his trauma deep within his heart, expressing it only as anger, hatred, and a burning desire for revenge against Traya. And this was Sion's true source of power. Not his physical pain, but his emotional pain. Like Nihilus's hunger, Sion's trauma utterly consumed him, squeezing out all other thought, all other feeling, until it was all he was. It fueled him to the point of immortality, and it gave him purpose, if a twisted one, to spread his pain to those he believed had wounded him, to the Jedi and his former master. Sion's chosen purpose for himself was, from a certain point of view, to continue the cycle of abuse. In this, he's sort of a mirror image of the player character in KOTOR 2 if they choose the light side path. The journey of a light side exile is about recovering from trauma by helping heal the trauma of others. Darth Sion, meanwhile, represents the opposite path. Like many people in the real world, his response to trauma is to lash out at those around him, to try and spread his pain to others. In the real world, this often is an unintentional act of cruelty, but Sion, at least, knows what he's doing and has deemed it his life purpose.
I fight because it is the power that the Force fills me with. To survive. To inflict the pain on others.
Many Sith over the millennia lived similarly tortured existences, consumed by their own unspoken pain and trauma, and determined to spread it to everyone around them. Darth Vader was the most obvious example of this. Others included Darth Bane, Orlick Qel-Droma, and to an extent, Darth Sidious. These Sith were miserable, but the tunnel vision of the dark side prevented them from seeing any way out of their pain. No other option apart from wallowing in it. The teachings of the Sith urged those on this path to turn their pain into power, to use it exactly as Darth Sion used it, as an unending source of anger and hatred they could use to fuel their strength in the dark side. The Sith saw their ability to use their pain in this way as yet another indication of their superiority. Pain killed the weak, they claimed, and drove the strong, providing them with focus and power. This was a philosophy Sion embraced wholeheartedly, and as the way of the Sith promised, it gave him tremendous power, the power of immortality, no less. But Sith who embraced this philosophy were deceiving themselves, and Sion was living, well, sort of living, proof of it. There are more emotions that come from pain than anger and hatred, and not even Darth Sion was immune to feeling the more complicated, less dark side conducive ones. His relationship with Traya throughout KOTOR 2 is evidence of this. He clearly hated her, but at the same time he was jealous of the exile, her latest apprentice, for taking his place. The final chapter of the game shows that Sion's relationship with Traya was far more complicated than he ever would have admitted. While he hated her, he also clearly wanted the respect she had for the exile, to be acknowledged by Traya and accepted as her apprentice once more. If the player character is female, all of this is complicated even further by the fact, in spite of everything he's done to become nothing but anger and hatred, Sion is attracted to the exile. He hates himself and the exile for it, deeming it a weakness that he needs to purge, but is unable to do so. No matter how far he's fallen, he's unable to prevent himself from feeling love. As a result, in his final battle with the exile on Malachor, Sion even expresses some twisted form of compassion for a female player character, fighting not out of hatred, but from a desire to spare the exile the pain that awaits her at the heart of Malachor. Compassion, of course, is anathema to everything the Sith believe, and Sion knew this, yet he couldn't change what he felt. No matter how much it affected his judgment, however, It wasn't Sion's love that defeated him in the end. Like Darth Nihilus, he had defeated himself, and he had done so long before the exile returned to Malachor. To understand why, we need to circle back to Darth Sion's most striking feature, his effective immortality. Immortality was one of the primary goals of the Sith, and it had been from the very beginning of their order. In fact, that was the meaning of the title Darth. It was derived from the Rakatan phrase Darth Traya, meaning Conqueror of Death. The Sith saw death as the final restriction on their power, the last chain keeping them from true, total freedom. This stood in stark contrast to the views of the Jedi, who saw death as something to be embraced when it came. The Jedi believed that, upon death, those who died became part of the will of the Force, losing their individuality but living on as part of a greater whole. The Sith had no such legends. Indeed, many Sith believed that there was no life after death. Many believed that Sith and others who were particularly evil in life went to chaos upon death, a sort of hell within the netherworld of the Force, but the extent to which this was true is unknown. Some theorize that the Sith's chaos was just a different interpretation of the Jedi's eternal oneness with the Force. While the Jedi accepted the loss of their individuality and embraced cosmic oneness, to the hyper-individualistic Sith, such a fate would have been worse than death itself. The nature of the afterlife aside, death nonetheless stripped even the mightiest Sith of their power, and so the Sith constantly sought to avoid it. To be able to avoid death would be to achieve ultimate power, everlasting and unassailable from the Sith perspective. It would allow the strength of the Sith to grow indefinitely without the constraints of a mortal lifespan. Thus, most Sith at least put some thought into cheating death, while some devoted their entire lives trying to discover a way of achieving immortality. Some Sith, among them Ajunta Pal, Marka Ragnos, and Exar Kun, found ways to persist after death in a limited form as spectres, usually through attachment to dark side artifacts. They did this by becoming so attached to these particular objects that they invested a part of their souls into them, and as a result, when their bodies died, their spirits persisted in the material world, tied to those objects. But this was a very limited way of cheating death, as these spectres would have very limited power over the material world and minimal freedom of movement. Ajunta Pal, for example, tied his spirit to his sword, and since his sword was buried with him when he died, his spirit was trapped in his tomb for thousands of years until the redeemed Revan convinced him to return to the light and let himself die. Other Sith pursued genuine immortality, among them Darth Plagueis, Darth Andeddu, and Darth Sidious. Darth Andeddu and Darth Sidious attempted this by stealing new, younger bodies for their spirits to inhabit when their current ones wore out. Andeddu would steal the bodies of random victims, which required him to be able to defeat and drive out their own souls, while Darth Sidious made clone bodies for himself that offered no such resistance. Plagueis, meanwhile, experimented with micromanaging midichlorians through the Force, a much more scientific method of attempting to cheat death than the other Sith pursued, and an equally futile one. All of these methods were limited and doomed to fail in some way or another. Of all the Sith, Darth Sion was really the only one to achieve the goal of immortality. Others could cheat death, sometimes multiple times in a row for hundreds of years, but Darth Sion was able to will himself to continue living in his original body indefinitely, with no limitations beyond his will to stay alive. Doing so wasn't easy. It took tremendous strength of will, which Sion had to maintain for every second of his existence, lest his body fall apart on him. But this was something Sion achieved, allowing him to keep living through mortal wound after mortal wound. Where Darth Nihilus was an unstoppable force, Darth Sion was an immovable object, and like his counterpart, he had achieved a form of what the Sith considered ultimate power. More impressively, he had achieved the form of ultimate power that constantly eluded the Sith, that only he was ever able to attain. But Sion's technique wasn't perfect. It did have a single weakness, as HK-47 observed.
Doubt, Master. It has killed many Jedi, and it has killed many Sith. Make him doubt himself, his beliefs, or his intentions. Such things disrupt connections to the Force, and death soon follows.
Darth Sion was only immortal so long as he had the will to be, and while his will was strong, the exile only had to show him the truth of his existence to erode it. Because at the end of the day, much like with Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion's power meant nothing. As we've described already, Sion paid an enormous cost for his immortality in the form of his constant pain, but there were other costs as well. Sion's techniques gave him no choice but to remain firmly committed to the dark side, which he relied upon to hold himself together. But the dark side was self-destructive, and by traveling its path, the Sith lost themselves. They had to give up everything worth living about life to become creatures of anger and hatred alone. Sith could live for no one but themselves and for no purpose apart from increasing their power. Power they sought as an end in itself. As we described earlier, the dark side destroyed its users' humanity, their very beings. The Revenge of the Sith novelization details what this is like from Darth Vader's perspective. You killed her because, finally, when you could have saved her, when you could have gone away with her, when you could have been thinking about her, you were thinking about yourself. It is in this blazing moment that you finally understand the trap of the dark side, the final cruelty of the Sith, because now yourself is all you will ever have, and within your furnace heart you burn in your own flame. Darth Sion, like Darth Vader, spent his life burning in his own flame. He lived a torturous existence of his own making, one that he stubbornly refused to give up on despite the cost. To keep living, he had to give up everything that made life worthwhile, because, like Darth Nihilus, Sion was a slave to his own power. It was the dark side that kept Sion alive, and he had to sacrifice everything in its name to purge himself of anything that didn't fuel the dark side. To achieve immortality, he had to spend his every waking moment feeding the dark side forever, dependent on the leech that had destroyed him. Darth Sion could live forever, but he had nothing to live for. His revenge was a hollow goal, as revenge always is, and if he had ever attained it, he would have had nothing, no purpose at all. And because he had nothing to live for, that Sion could live forever was meaningless. The eternal life he had wrought for himself was just eternal torture. In the end, what defeated Darth Sion was a single question posed by the exile: whether the life he had lived had been worth it. No matter his convictions, he could not escape the answer that it was not.
No matter how many I killed, there was no end to the pain. The blades the Force tore through my flesh.
But the exile was not the one who had defeated Darth Sion. His existence was a defeat in and of itself, bereft of meaning and anything worth living for. The exile simply gave him the choice of freeing himself, which was, in the end, what Sion did. Once he realized the meaninglessness of his existence, he surrendered to death, and he did so happily.
I am glad to leave this place, at last.
Darth Sion achieved one of the ultimate goals of the Sith, yet in the end, he chose to throw it away, to abandon immortality because it wasn't worth it. There are worse things than death, as Sion learned. Being condemned forever to the path of the dark side was one of them. There's an interesting bit of irony in Star Wars, which is that despite the Jedi embracing death and the Sith being obsessed with immortality, true, independent life after death was something that only the Jedi could achieve. In the Revenge of the Sith novelization, the spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn explains why to Yoda. Eternal life is the ultimate goal of the Sith, yet they can never achieve it. It comes only through the release of self, not the exaltation of self. It comes through compassion, not greed. Love is the answer to darkness. Only by letting go could one achieve a form of eternal life that was worth living, because only through letting go, through selflessness, could one retain genuine connections to the world around them. It was these connections that made life worth living, or so the Jedi would have you believe. This brings us to our last topic of discussion, the true antagonist of Knights of the Old Republic 2. Throughout the game, the faces of the Sith threat, the faces of the dark side, are Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus. But when you speak to Traya about the Sith, she alludes to a third Sith Lord that the exile must defeat. She is vague on the details and only brings this final Sith Lord up once, and there's a fairly simple reason for that. She herself is this final Sith Lord, Darth Traya, the Lord of Betrayal. She reveals herself only at the end of the game, after she's manipulated the exile into drawing out and destroying her enemies, the two former apprentices that had betrayed her. Traya is the final boss of KOTOR 2, and she provides our third and final example of what the end state of the dark side looked like. For reasons we'll get into later, Traya is sometimes thought of as a neutral character, aligned with neither the light side nor the dark side. KOTOR's alignment system seems to back this up. She shows up as perfectly neutral on the alignment meter, and unlike with all your other companions, her alignment doesn't change as your influence with her and your own force alignment do. But this seeming neutrality is a deliberately crafted facade. Traya claims to neither be Jedi nor Sith, and that at least is true, but she isn't neutral. This is evident at the end of the game. Once you've learned who she truly is, if you use the Foresight ability while approaching Traya for the final boss fight, it's revealed that her force alignment has changed, and she will show up as unmistakably aligned with the dark side. This, to be clear, is entirely in keeping with her philosophy, as we'll discuss shortly. Still, Traya had her differences with the Sith, and especially with her former apprentices. She had her own dark side philosophy, one firmly rooted in the basic precepts of the Sith, but sharply different in its conclusions. Traya represents a subtler form of the dark side. Like Traya's change in alignment, this is reflected in KOTOR 2's game mechanics. Like its predecessor, KOTOR 2 has many moments that allow you to shift your force alignment closer to the light side or dark side by doing particularly good or evil things. Actions that result in a light side shift are all treated the same by the game. They're classified as good, and they earn you influence with your light side leaning companions and cost you influence with your more evil companions. But the game actually divides dark side actions into two different categories, cunning and psychotic. Psychotic actions are over-the-top evil things that are the staple of dark side playthroughs of most Star Wars games. Murdering people for no reason, stealing candy from small children, that sort of deal. These actions earn you influence with your evil companions and cost you influence with your good companions. But both good and psychotic actions cost you influence with Traya. The only actions she respects are those that fall into the cunning category. These are much more subtle cruelties, low on violence and heavy on deception and manipulation, and they're usually part of larger, intricate plans. Put another way, the cunning aspect of the dark side is about shaping the world to your own ends, seeing the connections between living things and manipulating them with skill. When Traya's other teachings are taken as context, this aspect of the dark side sees the failings of the Sith and rejects them, instead returning to the roots of Sith philosophy, individualism. Traya's version of the dark side rejected the forms of meaningless power that other Sith were consumed by, but it clung to the foundations of the dark side, the principles of selfishness and self-reliance. It glorified the strength of the individual above all, and from its individualism it derived an understanding of strength, power, and the Force that the other paths of the Sith lacked. So, who was Darth Traya exactly? The answer is much more complicated than it seems. Traya, as the player knows her, took up the title when she fell to the dark side after the Battle of Malachor V. Once, she had been a Jedi Master, a historian, but she had followed Revan, her greatest student, to war against the Mandalorians, and in the war's final battle, she was believed dead. But she had survived, and like all who had followed Revan except the exile, she became Sith. When Revan's Sith Empire fell, it was Darth Traya who rallied the remnants at Malachor, taking Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion as her apprentices and ordering their war of extermination against the Jedi. But Traya was betrayed by her apprentices, stripped of the Force, and exiled. In exile, her philosophy evolved, and in time, she regained her connection to the Force. She joined the Jedi exile, and the rest was history. At the end of the game, Kreia reclaims the title of Darth Traya in your final battle with her in the Traya's Core at the heart of Malachor. But this was less a return to the Sith and more a final test for the exile. Kreia was merely setting herself up as one last obstacle for her greatest student to overcome. The title of Darth Traya was not truly who she was, not anymore, and in fact, there's a point earlier in the game where she considers passing it to someone else. KOTOR 2 has a fourth major antagonist, the Jedi Master Atris, who, while not a Sith, had secretly fallen to the dark side, and Kreia implied that she, too, was Darth Traya, or could have become Darth Traya.
So that there was once a Darth Traya, and that she cast aside that role, was exiled, and found a new purpose. But there must always be a Darth Traya, one that holds the knowledge of betrayal, who has been betrayed in their heart, and will betray in turn. You have...
Atris's journey down this path was ended by the exile before it could truly begin, so her story is a topic for another video entirely. But the way Kreia treats the title of Darth Traya here is interesting. Darth Traya was less a person and more a role, a purpose that Kreia, at times, fulfilled. So who was Darth Traya? She was the Lord of Betrayal, traitor to both the Jedi and the Sith, whose teachings she found lacking. She saw through the hypocrisy and contradictions of those who opposed her, unraveling them and their teachings alike. And she was the alternative end to the path of the dark side, an alternative to the dead roads followed by Nihilus and Sion, whispering promises of strength from within, the power of self and doctrines of individualism to those strong enough to listen. Individualism was fundamental to the way of the Sith, and to the dark side as a whole. In fact, it was a major factor in what divided the dark side from the light. The way of the light, the way of the Jedi, was completely concerned with prioritizing the greater good, with self-sacrifice and humility. The Jedi were servants of the will of the Force, and they embraced the Force's connective nature. The greatest among them could give up their very individuality, drain themselves of all sense of self, and become pure instruments of the Force, agents of balance. That's all to say that the way of the light was fundamentally anti-individualistic. That's not the same as being anti-individuality, mind you. The Jedi accepted and embraced the individuality of living beings as a natural aspect of life. But they rejected the ideological concept of individualism, the prioritization of self-reliance and independence above all. That's because, from the perspective of the Jedi, there was really no such thing. All life was bound by the Force, after all, and therefore no one could ever truly be self-reliant or independent. The Sith would disagree. They, and all followers of the dark side, were individualist in the extreme. They saw the bonds the Force wove between all living beings not as collective strengths to be nurtured, but as tools of manipulation that the strong could use to claim their rightful place in the natural order. Use of the dark side meant rejecting the will of the Force, and instead of bending the Force to one's own will, instead of opening themselves up to the currents of life, as Lightsiders did, Darksiders tried to control those currents. While the Jedi were focused entirely on the well-being of the collective whole, the Sith were entirely concerned with themselves, with increasing their power by preying on others. They saw all living beings as competitors, struggling against one another to become stronger and more powerful, and they sought to abuse their connection to the Force to climb to the top of the ladder, become the strongest and most powerful. To do so, the Sith drew heavily on the Force. As we discussed when talking about Darth Sion, the Sith altered themselves to amplify their power in the dark side, purging themselves of all that wasn't anger or hatred to achieve ultimate power. And as we discussed when talking about Darth Nihilus, the Sith abused their bonds with other living things to drain power from others, stealing from the weak to increase their own strength. The Sith used the Force to achieve their ends, and to increase their power, they made themselves more useful to the dark side of the Force. As the last line of the Sith Code claimed, they saw the Force as the key to their freedom. Traya, for the most part, agreed with the foundational philosophy of the Sith. She was an individualist. She believed in endless competition in the pursuit of power, and she worshipped strength and despised weakness. Her disagreement with the Sith was primarily in how they understood strength and power, particularly in relation to the Force. In KOTOR 2, Traya explains this disagreement to dark side player characters after Hanha, the Mad Wookiee, joins the party. She teaches the player to drain strength from Hanha, but also gives them the choice of refusing to do so. If the player does refuse to draw strength from Hanha, they earn praise from Traya, who says that they have learned the true lesson of strength, to turn away from strength that is not your own. True strength and power, Traya believed, can only come from the self. All other things that are perceived as strength and power, she taught, are dependency, and when they're ripped away, one is left as a shell of what they once were. This, she would argue, was the true failing of both Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion, the reason why both of their paths ended in self-destruction. They had both been completely reliant on a false form of power. They were dependent on the Force, without which they were nothing. This is something she begins expressing very early on in KOTOR 2 in relation to both the Sith and the Jedi.
Explain something to me.
I do not have the years required, nor the desire to indulge you.
If she served in the war, well, Jedi are supposed to be tough, capable.
Yes, and what are they without the Force? Take the greatest Jedi Knight, strip away the Force, and what remains?
Traya's disagreement with the Sith Code concerned its final line. The Force shall free me, because the Force was not true strength. It was an outside power upon which its users were dependent. Traya believed in the foundations of Sith philosophy and in their struggle for ultimate power, but believed that the power they were chasing was only a shadow, and that in reality, even the greatest of the Sith found only slavery in the Force, not freedom. Real ultimate power, Traya believed, came from self-reliance and total independence, including independence from the Force. That is the goal of the third and final path of the dark side, ultimate power through total independence. It's a path that no Sith, save Darth Traya, ever attempted, and it's a path that betrays fundamental aspects of the Sith, including the Force itself. This, of course, raises the question of whether it even still counts as being a path of the dark side, to which the answer is yes. Even without the Force, the philosophy and goals of the dark side would remain, and the same is true for the way of the light side. That topic might be a video in itself, but for now, let's get back to the point at hand. Independence from the Force, for those existing in the Star Wars universe, was an even more ambitious goal than eternal life. The Force was part of life itself, so thoroughly ingrained that both the Jedi and the Sith believed that there could be no life without the Force. Even so, there were means of cutting people off from the Force to varying degrees. The Jedi had a technique that allowed them to blind people to the Force, which they used to capture the Sith Lord Ulic Qel-Droma during the Great Sith War. Traya was actually subjected to this same technique by Darth Nihilus when he and Sion betrayed her. There were also those who had chosen to deafen themselves to the Force, as Luke Skywalker did in canon. But none of these were true examples of severance from the Force. In both cases, those who were supposedly cut off from the Force were just rendered unable to perceive it. The Force still flowed through them, and they just couldn't access it. Traya believed this form of severance wasn't genuine independence from the Force because it still left those cut off open to manipulation by the Force's will. The will of the Force was something that Darksiders defied, but it still exerted influence over all that were touched by the Force. It even used the Sith to achieve its ends at times. And it was the will of the Force that Traya despised above all, because its existence only reinforced that no being that was connected to the Force could ever genuinely be independent. No matter what choices they made, the Force would still be able to use them for its own ends. As Traya saw it, the will of the Force manipulated all living things, which were powerless to do anything about it. But then there was the Exile, who had made a choice that no other living being had ever made. She had chosen life without the Force. The Exile, as we discussed earlier, was one of those who made strong Force bonds to all beings around her, and at the Battle of Malachor 5, she'd experienced all those she was tied to dying at once, transmitting their unspeakable pain through those bonds. It was something that no one could survive, and yet the Exile did survive, and she had done so by severing her connection to the Force so completely that it left a wound. At Malachor, the Exile had truly cut herself off from the Force, and in that choice, Traya saw a path to true independence. But this couldn't be achieved just by repeating the Exile's choice. Even the Exile existed in a galaxy bound together by the Force, and though it could no longer use her directly, it still had a degree of influence and control by virtue of controlling everything around her. Traya's vision of independence involved far more dramatic action.
It is said that the Force has a will. It has a destiny for us all. I wield it, but it uses us all, and that is abhorrent to me, because I hate the Force. I hate that it seems to have a will, that it would control us to achieve some measure of balance when countless lives are lost. But in you, I see the potential to see the Force die, to turn away from its will, and that is what pleases me. You are beautiful to me, Exile. A dead spot in the Force, an emptiness in which its will might be denied.
The millennia of war that had consumed the galaxy had left many wounds in the Force, with the largest being centered around Malachor 5, and Traya sought to exploit them to cut the entire galaxy off from the Force, to try and kill the Force entirely. Doing so would give every living being the choice the Exile had faced, to cut themselves off from the Force or to die. Few would have the strength of will to make the Exile's choice, Traya understood, but those that did not were weak, she believed, and deserved to die so that the strong might have the independence they deserved. As we mentioned earlier, Traya is sometimes construed as a neutral character, but like the more recent example of Baylan's skull, she was just a less openly psychotic Darksider, and her willingness to cause the deaths of so many is proof of this. Traya may have been opposed to fundamental aspects of the Sith, but she was a disciple of the dark side through and through. Her hostility to the Force is honestly just further proof of this. After all, the dark side was fundamentally a perversion of the Force, opposed to all it was supposed to be. Traya, of course, never achieved her end goal. The Exile killed her upon her return to Malachor 5, where she healed the wound in the Force there and destroyed the planet entirely, preventing anyone from carrying out Traya's plan. So we technically don't have an example for what this last end state of the dark side would actually look like, but we know enough to extrapolate all the same. Obviously, this path is extreme, even more so than the others we've discussed today. The death of the Force would cause an omnicide on a truly unimaginable scale, for while some would make the choice to survive, most would be unable to. And even if we were interested in justifying such a thing, which we aren't, even if it could be achieved and someone was able to achieve true ultimate power, what would it be worth? And what, besides the obvious, would it cost? We know, for example, what adherence to the ideology of the dark side, even in opposition to the Force, did to Traya. Her destruction was nowhere near as dramatic as what happened to Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion, but it was destruction nonetheless. As with all who walked the path of the Sith, Traya's adherence to the dark side stripped her of her humanity to the point where she was unable to see the humanity in others. Her willingness to cause so much death was evidence of this, as was her casual dismissal of most of the people the player encounters in KOTOR 2. Traya couldn't even see the humanity in the other members of your party, who she next to never refers to by their names, instead giving them all derisive, categorical nicknames. Aton, for example, was the fool, while Visas was the blinded one, Hanhar was the beast, Baldur was the alien, and so on. This wasn't just a meaningless quirk. Traya saw all those around her as tools, not as people, and this was even true of the exile, who Traya saw just as a unique and especially valuable tool. Just as Traya could not see the humanity in anyone else, she had lost all of her own as well. Her failure to see anyone else as a person precluded her from developing genuine human connection, as did her ideology. She understood no relationship other than conflict, which she worshipped as a source of strength. Everything was competition and manipulation to her, a constant zero-sum game of all against all, with all beings seeking to exploit each other for their own ends. From such a perspective, independence and self-reliance are extremely desirable goals, because if life is just competition, then relying on others is setting yourself up for betrayal. But fortunately for us all, the world is not as Traya saw it. Traya was right in understanding that true independence and self-reliance were impossible with the Force. But where her ideology fails is in valuing those things above all else. Because even without the Force, living beings would still be connected, and that was something Traya never understood. Human connection exists independent of the Force, and like it or not, its existence makes us all dependent on each other. There would still be no such thing as full independence, no thing as self-reliance even in a forceless world. Traya's other failing was in buying into the lie of the Sith, the lie that all life was locked in an endless struggle for strength and power. Such struggles exist, but they're only a fraction of what there is in life, and what makes living things truly special is not how they compete, but how they cooperate. Mutualism is a fact of nature, and our bonds are what define us. They're not to be drained, but to be nurtured by both parties so that all might be strengthened. This is a lesson Knights of the Old Republic 2 presents at a few key moments. At the start of the game, when the player first comes to Telos, Chodo Habat, the leader of an Ithorian herd helping to rebuild the planet, reaches out and offers to try and help heal your connection to the Force in exchange for your assistance in the herd's disputes with Zerka Corporation. If the player sides with the Ithorians against Zerka, Traya will regularly voice her objections. As she eventually describes in depth, she believes all healing to be manipulation and cannot see Chodo Habat as anything but malicious. In reality, she was simply projecting onto Chodo. He defied the ideological framework through which she saw the world, and she was unable to understand him. As the player learns, Chodo Habat was entirely straightforward in his motivations and genuine in his offer of healing, and after Traya casts doubt on his abilities to actually heal the exile, claiming that healing a dead planet is entirely different from healing a Jedi severed from the Force, Habat explains why. With all due respect, I believe you are wrong. In healing a planet, it is a matter of connections. As plants feed animals and animal populations thrive and grow, life connects and expands, the living web of the Force. I've walked in the growing restoration zones and felt the fullness of life, and perhaps that connection will help make you whole again. Perhaps you will find more than you think on the surface. You, me, my herd helped to build that, the life of the planet. Though we describe the restoration as a process, we are, in truth, opening Telos to the Force. This is the lesson of the light side, one that no Sith could ever understand. Strength is not a zero-sum game, and the most worthwhile forms of it are gained through cooperation, not competition. Connections through the Force were a source of strength, not in how they could be exploited, but simply by virtue of their existence. Codependence and mutualism provide far greater strengths than the Sith could ever dream of. the strength of human connection, the strength of the greater whole, and above all, the strength of healing. And beyond that, strength isn't the only thing that matters in life. Even if they were not a source of strength, our bonds would still be worth it. They are what defines us. Every aspect of ourselves is influenced by everyone around us, and that is something to be celebrated. As KOTOR 2 takes great pains to emphasize, every choice we make casts an echo, and while this means we must be cautious to avoid causing harm through carelessness, it also means that we can all work to strengthen each other, even through the smallest efforts. That was the true meaning of the choice the exile made at Malachor, because even without the Force, even after a decade of purposely isolating herself, the exile never lost the power of human connection, and that was what made her special in the first place. And in KOTOR 2's canon storyline, on the light side path, the exile used that power to heal wherever she traveled, and as she grew in strength, so did everyone around her.
Even you, and where they look at you and see the death of the Force, I look at you and see hope for all life. I look at you and see that perhaps a life untouched by the Force is not the punishment it is believed to be.
Using the power of interconnection was the true trap of the dark side, one that not even Traya could escape. She may have escaped the dead ends that the other Sith met, but her own path had destroyed her in its own way. The path of Darth Traya ended only in bitterness and isolation. No matter how one approached it, and no matter how novel their approach, the way of the dark side was a dead road, and there was nothing worthwhile at its end. Not power, not immortality, not even independence. Of all the paths available to those consumed by the dark side, there was only one that was worth taking: the path back to the light. We hope you've enjoyed this analysis of the Sith Lords of Knights of the Old Republic 2. But what do you think? Has this changed your perspective on the dark side at all? Or do you think we've missed something? Free to post your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.